next video of the International Horror Series. The following stories all originate from Japan this week. Hope you enjoy. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the terror. Number 1. I should start off by saying that my brother is not only a military man, he's your basic hetero, never let them see you cry cliche of a military man. He's not afraid of anything, well except the entire country of Japan. This is his story. My brother joined the Marines when he was 18 and was stationed in Japan. He really enjoyed his time there for a while, the girls specifically. He made friends with some of the Japanese guys his age who worked around the base. On nights, where him and his soldiers' friends had the nights off, the local Japanese guys would show them around, bring them to bars, introduce them to girls, etc. One night, after a little bit of drinking and no luck with the girls, the guy invited my brother home to play video games. My brother accepted the invite and they played video games for a few hours. During this time, he tells my brother the main reason he wanted to go home early was because his little sister was suffering from night terrors, causing her to wake up screaming, crying, and sometimes vomiting. He was worried about her and wanted to be home in case she had another episode. At this point of the story, I should explain to you how this guy's house was shaped. The house was built in the shape of a horseshoe with a garden in the middle. His bedroom was at the very edge of the one side of the U, his sister's all the way at the other end, so they were essentially across a garden from each other. If he looks out his window, he can see into hers and vice versa. So, anyways, they decided to call a night, and the Japanese guy walks over to the window and looks across the garden into his sister's window to check on her. He lifts the blinds and peers out for a fraction of a second before jumping back and screaming and looking at my brother like he just saw something horrible. My brother then goes to look, and he stops him. He tells him that he saw a dark cloud with red eyes hovering over his sister's sleeping body. My brother naturally does not believe him and decides to look for himself. He creeps quietly over to the window and lifts the blinds, but this time he finds himself eye to eye with what he describes as a black puff of smoke with a face. My brother and this other guy admit that they got under the guy's covers and stayed there until it was light outside, too afraid to lift the blankets and see the smoky figure had come a little bit closer and was in the room with them, just on the other side of the thin sheet. I don't know what to believe, or if maybe they drank more than what they said they did that night and imagined it all, but I know my brother believes what he saw. He sticks to his story. When he tells it, he looks like someone who saw something truly sinister. Number 2. This happened a few years ago, and if there are any of my classmates lurking around, they may be able to recognize this occurrence as it caused quite a stir in my dormitory. I was in an exchange program in Kyoto, Japan for the duration of a year. Beautiful city full of history. For those of you that don't know, the city itself is ringed with mountains creating a large geographical bowl. In the summer it makes the city sizzle, and in the winter you can still get snow, which is quite nice. The place just feels old. I can't say I've lived anywhere quite like it. It's a mixture of new and old, modernized but not quite westernized. Yes, they have convenience stores and shopping malls, but there are also temples and Shinto shrines and large graveyards where you can burn incense for the dead. I don't say this to try and impress upon you that the city was creepy or terrifying, just that you could feel how old it is. I only felt terrified on one occasion. I saw the spirit, or whatever it was, sometime around 4 in the morning. The dorm I lived in was pretty old, but it housed a lot of foreigners who studied at the university nearby. The hallways felt sterile, like a hospital, and this characteristic feel was supported by long fluorescent bulbs in every hallway, which at midnight were cut off except for 1 or 2 safety lights. My room was positioned at the end of a long hallway besides 2 large emergency exit doors. These doors had large opaque windows which had always given me the creeps. I avoided looking at them whenever I went into my room for the fear of seeing a hand or face pressed against them. Anyways, at 4 a.m., I went to the bathroom, which is shared by everyone in the dorm. I left my door propped open because the doors shut and lock automatically behind you, and I didn't want to bother taking my key, which is also used to turn on the electricity to the room. As soon as I stepped outside the room, I felt instant dread. To my left was a dark shadow, human, hunched over. To me it looked like it had its heads in its hand. It rocked a little back and forth, stopped for a minute, not looking directly at it. It made no noises. Then I turned left and walked away from it to the bathroom. I didn't meet anyone else in the hall and didn't hear anyone come out from their room or doors close, which is really loud because they swing shut automatically. I tried to convince myself that it was a prank, but then the nightmares began. Every night, vivid nightmares about a dark shadow pulling me out of my bedroom window, out of cars, out of an airplane. I slept very little, and I always sleep with the light on. Other students in the dorm complained that they too had felt something strange late at night. One girl told me she felt someone sit on her bed watching her. The other student explained how, for the past week or so, someone knocked on his door every morning at 2 a.m. Eventually, these stories got back to our dorm mother, a sweet Japanese woman who was and still is in charge of running the dormitory with her husband. I was walking downstairs to shower when she called me over. She questioned me about the spirit, about the nightmares. Then she said, "Why don't you go take a bath? Soak your feet. You'll sleep better." I had already planned to do this, but I thanked her anyways. When I returned to my room, there was a small paper towel outside my door with a tiny pile of salt on it. I noticed the same thing by each one of the exits. The large double doors at the end of the hallway that always spooked me, the front door to the dormitory, and even at the end of each hallway, where there was large sliding glass windows. I don't know why or how, but my nightmares ceased. No one complained of any spirit after that, and eventually I stopped thinking about it. That was 4 years ago. I finished my study and returned home to my country, but now I'm back in Japan. And in my apartment, I've started to notice things falling, objects being knocked over while I'm sleeping, and for now I'm ignoring them, but I'm starting to get that dark feeling of dread again. Number 3. One of the residents, I'll call him James, at the retirement home told me this once. He was stationed in Okinawa after the war. They wanted to keep an eye on the Japanese, and for good reason. In some parts of the country, the natives weren't aware that the war was over, or they weren't ready to accept defeat. Either way, they constantly had to be on high alert, jumping at shadows and wishing they had eyes in the back of their head. Within every clump of tall grass, there appeared to be an enemy lurking with a knife, waiting to cut our throat once our backs were turned. Every tree contained a sniper lining us up in his crosshairs. Lived in constant state of paranoia during the time in Okinawa. Finally got transferred to work on one of the supply ships offshore. I thought this would calm my nerves a bit. However, it didn't. Instead of worrying about banzai attacks and sniper fire, I found myself keeping peeled eyes towards the sky, anxiously awaiting an attack. The crew was nervous too, but with each passing day, the tranquility to the sea helped us feel more and more relaxed. After a couple of weeks, we started to joke around, show each other pictures of our girls back home, and enjoy the wonderful climate. But then we started to think the war was really over. Our surprise came just before dawn. Our ship would have been attacked whether we were ready or not. There wasn't anything we could have done to prevent it. Our only goal that morning was to survive. I learned an important lesson that day. Chivalry and decency seem to disappear whenever there is panic. The pandemonium that happened shortly after the first plane crashed into our ship has left me with mixed feelings of reproach and guilt. I was asleep when the final plane struck. At first, I thought we somehow hit a rock as I tossed from my bunk and onto the cold, hard floor. I heard frantic shouting above me, and a sobering thought entered my head. We were under attack. I stumbled onto the deck and was greeted by a scene of chaos and anarchy. My crewmates were scrambling in erratic movements. Some were trying to contain the flames, which were rapidly swallowing the ship. Others were heading for lifeboats. A few had opted to dive over the side, hoping to find refuge in the warm waters below. None were following the orders of the captain, who was barking at us to remain our ground. We were, after all, only a supply ship. We had no firepower to return to our assailants. I quickly scanned the skies and my stomach dropped. 3 more Baka bombers were nosediving towards us, bent on delivering a swift death. I had not heard my name being called. I would have surely died right then and there. "James, James, over here!" My head snapped towards the starboard side, where I could see my crewmate, Kaozu, climbing into one of the few remaining lifeboats. He was waving his arms at me, and without a second thought, I sprinted over to him and dove into my only hope for safety. Before I could suggest to pick up a few more of the fellow crewmates, Kaozu dropped the line and we were plummeted into the sea below, just as a second plane crashed into our ship. Our little boat rocked dangerously from the force, and my ears began to ring from the explosion. All around us, I saw the hands of the drowning crew reaching for us, begging to be saved. Their screams as they were swept away to their watery grave would be the last things I heard before I slipped away into blackness. When I came to, I was surrounded by nothing but tranquil sea again. The water stretched on for miles. The carnage of our supply ship was nowhere to be seen and seemed like a distant memory. Kaz was busily rowing as I lethargically glanced around. I wondered how far we had traveled. "You're awake. I was ready to toss you overboard," Kaz said grimly, then gave me a waning smile. He was our ship's translator. We had chatted a few times, but to be honest, I knew very little about him. He had a few screws loose upstairs, but for the most part, he was alright. "Do you know where we are?" Kaz laughed. He probably knew squat about navigation. Based on the sheepish pitch of his laugh, I'd say we were lost. "We're safe, that's all that matters." "Yep, we're lost." "Did anyone else make it?" "Not that I know of. The ship sank." "What about the other lifeboats?" Kaz shrugged. I suddenly remembered the hands that struggled to keep those poor men afloat and shuddered. Did Kaz just abandon those men? I mean, he was busy saving both our asses, but Jesus. I tried to use what little navigational knowledge I had to direct our course, but it was hopeless. Kaz managed to grab a bag of supplies before leaving the ship. I sifted through its contents. There was some food, mostly canned beans, jugs of water, a coil of rope, a knife, a line and hook, and a lighter. But there was nothing to direct us. No compass, no sextant. I even settled for a map. But now we're lost at sea. The boredom was sickening. I crafted a fishing rod using one of the oars, but the fish weren't biting. Once or twice Kaz asked if he could eat my corpse if I were to die first, but I hoped he was just joking. With not much else to do, we took turns keeping watch. One of us would sleep while the other stayed awake. This way, we had a lookout at all time. The sun beat down on my head during the day and the winds whipped across my face at night. I kept my eyes on the horizon for ships. At this point, I didn't care if they were friendly or not. I just wanted to get the hell off this boat. I woke up one afternoon to Kaz brooding. He usually greeted me with a snide remark, but none came this time, and something was wrong. "Everything okay?" I asked. "I saw something this morning." "What?" I asked hopefully. "There was a man out there. At least it looked like a man, but he was standing on top of the water. It could have been nothing, maybe just a hallucination." "Maybe," he replied and fell silent. I forgot about it as soon as Kaz fell asleep. I had an uneventful watch that day. Kaz kept insisting that he saw the man standing on the water while I was asleep. He told me that each morning he got closer and closer to our boat. I was beginning to get a little bit freaked out at this point, so I decided to stay awake during his watch. Sure enough, a little bit before dawn, I saw him too. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when Kaz nudged me and pointed him out, I knew it wasn't a hallucination. I heard Kaz mutter, "Don't speak," as we gazed at the strange phenomenon. There, standing on top of the water about 100 meters away, was a man. I held my breath as he turned and looked in our direction. It was as if he was looking straight at me. My blood suddenly ran cold and the hairs on my neck felt like needles. The man in the water didn't move. He just stood there and stared at us. The water flowed over his feet as if he were standing on some invisible island. When the sun came up, he simply vanished. "Hey, you saw him too?" "Just as I feared," Kaz mumbled once the day broke. "Who the hell was that?" I demanded. "Do you know anything about Japanese folklore?" he asked warily. I shook my head and Kaz inhaled deeply. "As a child, my father used to tell me stories about these figures in the water called Funa Yuri. He was supposed to be the souls of the victims who had drowned in the sea. According to the legends, they ask you for a spoon, a hishaku, which they use to fill up your boat with water and drown you. I always used to think they were just ghost stories meant to spook little children, but..." Kaz's voice drifted off. I morbidly thought of the drowning hands clawing desperately at the air, the hands that Kaz and myself abandoned. "Do we have a spoon?" he asked suddenly. I searched the contents of the bag, even though I knew there was no spoon. I said. "Kuso," Kaz cursed, grabbing his hair with both hands. "Why didn't I grab a spoon?" I let Kaz have his temper tantrum, and I wasn't really following him. Ghosts, spoons, then again... We're supposed to poke holes in it so our boat doesn't fill up with water. That way the spirits give up and leave us alone. Without a spoon, we're as good as dead. If we don't find a ship, we're as good as dead, I reminded him. The following night, Kaz shook me awake. There, look. He was pointing at the stern of his boat. I followed his fingers and gasped. Something was drifting up towards the boat. The water looked almost like floating balls of cotton. The shape quickly moved upward, its white face illuminating the surrounding darkness. As the figure surfaced, I could make out its hair floating wildly in the water. It gave off a gurgling sound, the sound of someone drowning. A pair of hands shot up out of the water, thrashing about, the hands of a drowning victim. This went on for about 5 terrifying minutes, before they went limp and disappeared back into the sea. I made a move towards them, but Kaz stopped me. It's a trick, he whispered. Then everything went quiet, but the figure was still under there, watching us. Suddenly, a face as white as snow emerged from the surface so that the water level came up to its chin. It was the man who we had been spotting for the past few nights. He wasn't treading water or anything, but still managed to remain afloat despite being as stiff as a piece of driftwood. He made a chuckling sound with his throat that sounded like it was full of water. Go away, Kaz cried. Leave us alone. Spoon. Give me a spoon, please. The man croaked. He looked straight at me and a chill ran down my spine like a poisonous spider. His eyes were glossy, dead. Please, I need it. It's like we don't have any. Now leave us, Kaz said it again. Meanwhile, I just sat there petrified. The man was talking to me. Please. I said no. Kaz roared and suddenly jumped to his feet and grabbed the oar. He held it over his head and brought it down onto the Funa Yuri. Kaz's actions were quick, but the spirit was quicker. The figure dropped below the surface as if something had pulled him down. With lightning speed, the spirit grasped the blade of the oar and gave it a tremendous tug. I had to grab Kaz to keep him from going overboard. Our boat threatened to capsize as the oar vanished into the water. We began frantically scanning all sides of the boat for the Funa Yuri, like two people surrounded by hungry sharks. 1 second, the dark water around us was peaceful. The next, there was a great splashing sound as hundreds of hands broke the surface of the water. They were struggling. They, too, were drowning. They shrieked and my body went numb. It sounded like a chorus of damned souls. My bladder let loose and I felt the warmth trickle down my leg. Next thing I knew, 5 dead hands wrapped around Kaz's face, torsos, and legs and pulled him over the side of the boat. He let out a scream that was cut short when he hit the water. Kaz was dragged to the bottom of the ocean, never to be seen again. The water around me became peaceful yet again, and the hands were gone. At this point, I accepted my fate. I prayed and I prayed that death would be swift and merciful, but no hands came for me. I was rescued a few days later by a passing merchant ship. Fortunately, the people on board spoke English and brought me to safety. They must have thought I was a lunatic as I babbled madly about drowning ghosts and spoons. Now I'm back at the retirement home. So what? The spirits just left you alone? I asked. James nodded his head, lost in thought. They never got me. I lived through a bonsai attack, kamikaze, bullets whizzing past my head. But that encounter was, without a doubt, the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I took a deep breath. I was a bit freaked out by James's tale. Why did they spare you? I asked, not expecting an answer. After a while, James spoke. The Funa Yuri are a vengeful spirit. I think they were out to get Kazu for abandoning our crew. What makes you say that? Because the man I saw standing on the water was the captain of our supply ship. Number 4. Sandy and I have been couch surfing across the cities of Asia for the last 6 months, safe in the bosom of civilization. After several weeks traveling across Japan, we decided that we wanted to see something other than towns and cities and began browsing last-minute tours of the Japanese countryside. Most of them were for the sort of tourist destinations we'd spent our time seeing. So far, none of these caught our eyes. We were looking for something off the beaten track. This looks perfect, said Sandy, pointing at her phone. This guide takes you to the lesser parts of a huge national park specifically to get away from the crowds. Imagine it. No parking lots jammed with tourists, packed coaches, just us, guide, and Japanese wild. It sounded perfect, but knowing how Sandy often got ahead of herself, I ran a quick search for reviews and couldn't turn up anything. No reviews? I guess it's a new tour. I said, gesturing to the fruitless search, but she was undeterred. Well, all the other tours are fully booked or send us to a soulless tourist trap, so we either roll the dice or spend a few days in the city. Besides, we'll have a great time no matter what the tour's like. We always do. She had a point. Her last minute impulsiveness had led us on many misadventures, planned or otherwise. And although we had some grim tales to tell, we'd never had a bad time. Okay, let's do it. I leaned over her shoulder and tapped her screen to book the outing. I knew you'd come around. Now let's make our last night in the city count. Karaoke time. With that, Sandy threw her arm over my shoulder and, ignoring my arguments for an early night, forced me out of the hotel door. The next day, I woke up with a horrible hangover, and my vocal cords, which were keen to remind me that my range was a lot smaller than I had thought the night before. After a hurried breakfast of coffee and painkillers, we were out the door and cramming ourselves into the sardine can that is the rush hour metro. After a 10-minute ride that lasted far longer than it had any right to, we swapped the underground for the blazing heat of the Japanese summer and walked a short distance to the tour meeting point where a friendly native pointed us in the general direction of our tour guide. I spotted a short Japanese lady wearing a luminous green vest sporting the words Takayasha Tours. Dragging Sandy away from a nearby vending machine, I approached the woman. Yukiko? I asked her, waving as we walked over. Hey, you're here for the mountain tours, she replied, a slight Japanese accent clinging to her English. We answered in an affirmative, gave our names, and before we knew it, we were bundling into the back of a minibus with Yukiko sitting up front to drive. On the drive through the city and out into the suburbs, Yukiko proved herself to be an able guide, dropping tidbits of information about the structures and areas we were driving through. Her easy manner and entertaining delivery brought the cities to life. Before long, gray was replaced with green as we left the city and headed into the countryside proper. Even through the window of the speeding vehicle, the countryside of Japan was a delight to behold, and the long journey to the mountains seemed to pass in an instant. Finally, Yukiko pulled the car off the main road onto a dirt track hidden in the shade of the trees at the base of a heavily wooded mountain. A few bumpy moments later, we reached a small clearing into the trees, and Yukiko brought the car to a stop. Okay, from here we have a small walk to the base of the mountains, following an old Shinto pilgrimage trail. We will pass many old shrines and temples on either side of the path, but it is not allowed for us to approach them. Feel free to take photos if you like, Yukiko told us once we were out of the minibus. The old pilgrimage trail was paved with haphazard placed gray bricks that seemed to rise up and catch your foot just as you looked away from them to take in the sight of a particularly striking shrine or torii gate. Each turn in the path revealed another charming tableau, as the summer sun dappled the path and set the bronze and red of the temples aglow, holding us enraptured until the uneven footing caught us unaware once more. We carried on down the trail for a while longer until we reached an old bench where Yukiko called a stop for lunch. While we ate, a distant chanting reached us from down the trail. Surprised, Yukiko explained, these temples are not used very often, and when they are, it's only on certain days, but this is none of them. Even if it was, we would be lucky to hear the ceremony so deep in the woods. She listened for a few moments and added, though I do not recognize the prayer. We continued along the path towards the rhythmic chanting. Through the tall trees we could see that the trail was taking us towards the green mountain, and while we walked, the sound of the rushing water joined the monks' chanting, increasing in volume until we came across a large lake. The mountain loomed across the lake from us, and a number of rapid streams swept down it and over the edge of the colossal boulder set into the face of the mountain, forming a collection of pure white waterfalls that shimmered in the midday sun. The trees huddled close around the lake, and the path led us through them past a large red temple set partly over the water on short round stilts. As we walked towards the temple, the chanting grew in intensity and the background noise of the forest began to fade, like a storm was approaching. Sandy and I caught each other's eyes apprehensively as the sky began to darken behind the mountain. Yukiko noticed our discomfort and reassured us. This far into the mountains, the weather can change quickly and without warning. But as darkness rapidly spread across the sky from behind the mountains, she seemed less confident. This doesn't seem like a storm. I worried out loud, and my fears were confirmed as the spreading darkness shrouded the sun, plunging us into an eerie twilight. The sky around the mountain looked like it had been replaced by a starless night, which gave way to a brilliant blue of a spotless sky at its edges. "I vote we head for that temple ASAP," Sandy said, fear in her voice. "Ditto," I replied, equally uncomfortable. "Normally I would not like to intrude a ceremony, but I think the monks will understand because of, this," said Yukiko, gesturing to the sky. With that, we hastily made our way towards the temple. The path wound through the three stone torii gates of increasing size, ending at the black steps which climbed to the front of the temple. The large entrance was shrouded by a cream drape, and candlelight flickered through them from the inside. The chanting of the monks slipped around the drapes and echoed around the silent lake as though they were standing right next to us, sending a chill up my spine. "It should be okay to enter, but take your shoes off before you go inside," said Yukiko as we ascended the steps. We kicked our shoes off, and I pushed through the drapes. I knew something was wrong as soon as my hand breached the threshold. My emotions stilled like the sound of nature had outside, and a wave of sickening black swept in to replace them, like sewage in a clear pool. As I fully passed through the drapes, the chanting abruptly stopped, not even leaving an echo behind. The bright candlelight hinted at through the material dimmed and went out, plunged into a large space of gloom. An empty husk of a building stood before me. The floor was strewn with debris from the forest, and three figures stood in the center of the room, their heads bowed as if in prayer. "Jesus Christ, what was that?" I heard Sandy whisper as she entered behind me. "Do you feel it? It's like the color drained out of the world." She looked around. "And what happened to the lights?" Shaken, and with no better idea of what happened to myself, I turned to her and shrugged. Yukiko approached the closest figure. "Sumimasen," she croaked, but none of them responded. As I moved in, I could see why. Mottled gray flesh was visible under the monk's tattered robes, as though it had begun putrefying where it stood, and a swollen tongue lolled out of its cracked lips like a blue slug. At once the decaying figures began chanting again, but this was not a clear, rhythmic sound from before. The voices that struggled out of the blocked mouths were somewhere between a whimper and a growl, the syllables intoned in an unsettling way. I caught Sandy's panicked eyes, and we both bolted for the exit in unison, Yukiko not far behind. As we passed through the now ruined drapes into the gloom outside, my ears began to ring heavily. "What the hell is going on here?" I said, panic staining my voice as we fled from the temple. I don't know," Yukiko yelled back as she ran. Once we covered what felt like a safe distance from the temple, we slowed down to catch our breath. "Who were those guys?" Sandy asked in between panting breaths. "I don't know what to think. It looked that way, and that feeling, ugh." "I don't know what's going on," Yukiko said in a small voice. Sensing her discomfort, Sandy changed the subject. "My ears are ringing like I've been standing too close to a speaker for the past 4 hours." "Yours too?" I rubbed my ears, but the sound persisted. The ringing continued to increase in intensity, and as we turned a corner, the mountain came back into view. "Wait, the mountain should be behind us. I think we went the wrong way. This way leads us back to the temple," Yukiko pipped out as she walked. "We must have gotten turned around when we ran from the temple," Sandy guessed. Our discussion was interrupted when the ringing in our ears became unbearably loud. Grabbing my head, I saw part of the mountain move. My jaw dropped as I realized that it wasn't part of the mountain at all, but it was a gigantic figure shrouded in gloom, walking from a dark void that had formed at the center of the dark sky and on the other side of the mountain. Is that a person?" I just heard Sandy say over the deafening ringing in my ears. Yukiko said something I couldn't make out. Her face was turning white as she just stared at this huge figure. The look on her face was close to awe. "Come on, we have to get out of here," Sandy yelled, snapping us out of our stupor. Both directions down the path we were on led back to the lake where the massive creature was heading, so we charged into the trees opposite us, hoping to put as much distance between us and it as possible. Scratches and falls were our constant companions as we ran full tilt through the barely lit forest. Crashing through bushes and jumping fallen trees, we pushed on until the ringing subsided to a bearable level. Catching her breath, Sandy managed to puff out, "Is everyone okay?" "Just about," I said between deep breaths. Yukiko responded, "I think so." Once my lungs stopped burning, I turned to Sandy and Yukiko. Guys, please tell me you have any idea what's going on here. Those monks were dead but still singing, and I'm fairly sure I just saw a giant skeleton come out of a hole in the sky and almost burst my eardrums, I blurted out. I could feel tears welling up as panic set in. Sandy stared at me blankly, as though she was just now starting to process what we'd seen, and Yukiko looked like she had passed through panic and arrived at whatever was on the other side. Looking at us, she slowly said, I think I think that was a Gashadokuro, a giant starving skeleton. In the tale, as you can tell, it is coming by the ringing in your ears and is summoned from the black hole in the sky. But they were meant to be just tales. Summoned. So someone called that thing here? Why would anyone do that? Who would do that? I spat, welcoming the anger in place of fear. The change in the tone of conversation shook Sandy out of her fugue. The monks, she said. Yukiko nodded. In one of the stories, it's summoned by a spell recital. That would explain why I've never heard the chant at a temple before. Right. So now we know there's a Gachadoku, or whatever it's called, here. What do we do? It's early afternoon. The sun is basically missing in action. We're literally lost in the woods, and none of us are even wearing shoes, Sandy said while rubbing a foot, and note of worry creeping into her voice. Yukiko, do you know where we are? I asked. I've never left the path before. I'm a guide, not an explorer. If we could see the mountain, I could find my way, but the trees are too tall here, she replied, looking at the towering conifers that surrounded us, compounding the gloom of the artificial twilight. I have an idea, Sandy said apprehensively, as though she wished she hadn't. We could follow the ringing to the landmark we recognize. That landmark might be a 100-foot tall skeleton or a temple full of zombie monks. I shot back, more anger in my voice than I intended. I know, but our only other option is to wander in the forest, in the dark, with that thing out there somewhere. She is right, Yukiko agreed. It gets cold in the mountains at night, and none of us are wearing proper clothing. If we stay out for too long, I don't think we'll make it through the night. I guess that settles it then, I admitted. I doubt we ran in a straight line, but heading back the way we came is better than picking a direction at random, I thought out loud. Agreed, said Sandy as Yukiko nodded. Sticking close together, we turned around, walking back the way we came, simultaneously hopeful and terrified that we would hear that head-splitting ringing again. A funny thing happens when you listen intently with next to no background noise. Most people find that their ears start ringing due to ear damage caused by one or more short-sighted decisions in their past. We weren't sure if we were mistaking tinnitus for the ringing of the giant, and though we tried to retrace our steps, in the gloom with no equipment, it was proving extremely difficult. We were starting to lose hope when an enormous crash resounded through the forest, loud enough to shake nearby trees. What in the hell was that? Sandy asked. Startled, I said. I have no idea. We stood in silence, facing the direction of the boom, straining our ears for any further clues. Sandy volunteered. I bet the skeleton had something to do with it. It's risky, but we should head in the direction that we heard the noise and hope we come across a landmark. With a clear goal in mind, we redoubled our efforts, and I felt hope bloom in my chest as the trees started to thin out and we could see the mountain again. Okay, we need to head that way, Yukiko said, pointing toward the mountain and taking the lead. The forest was becoming darker as we marched towards the mountain. Sandy sighed with relief when the trees suddenly gave way to the edge of the lake. From that side of the lake we should have seen waterfalls falling over the huge boulder embedded into the mountainside. My eyes widened when I saw that the boulder had been tossed to one side and the waters were falling into a gaping black hole in its place. Even in the gloom, we could see a gray frog was spreading outwards from the dark pit, draining the color from the surroundings. Where the monochrome frog touched, the plant life became desiccated and the clear blue lake water was replaced by a bog-like mess. Yomi, I heard Yukiko utter fearfully. The three of us stood there exhausted and gazing at the strange scene as our tired minds tried to process it. Looking at the gray fog filled me with an almost primal dread and a strange sense of familiarity, as though my body instinctively recognized what it was. The feeling of dread deepened when the ringing returned full force and something massive started rising from a deep shadow in the hole. The dim light from the shrouded sun bounced off an enormous mottled gray skull as a gashekadoru or whatever it's called. stepped out into the boggy lake. He looked in our direction, and the empty socket seemed to burn into us. "Not again," I said, my voice breaking with fear as I turned to run back into the woods with Sandy at my side. The ringing was becoming louder as we ran, and I pulled from the reserves I didn't know I had to speed up to a full tilt sprint. Branches whipped my face, and the forest floor tore into my socked feet, but I could barely feel it as the terror drove me onward like a frenzied animal. "Where's Yukiko?" Sandy screamed over the ear-splitting tone. Using all of my willpower, I stopped and turned to look through the trees. She had tripped, and the skeleton was almost on top of her. "Yukiko, run! Now!" I shouted at the top of my lungs, but Yukiko was frozen in place, clutching her head as the streams of dark blood trickled from her ears, seemingly unaware of the giant looming over her. The ringing still loud in our ears, we watched in horror as the skeleton reached for her from the lake, its bony fingers wrapping around her legs and torso to hold her in a massive skeletal fist. As the giant's fingers closed around her body, she realized what was happening and began to scream so loudly we could hear it even over the infernal ringing. The hulking skeleton slowly lifted Yukiko until her head was level with its enormous skeletal grin, each tooth the size of a pillow, and its jaw began to open. Yukiko thrashed in the giant's grip, but to no avail, and in slow motion we watched those massive teeth slam shut around her neck, arterial blood spraying down the creature's bony chin. Its jaw clamped shut, and the skeleton began wrenching the body away, leaving tattered muscle, shredded sinews, and a gleaming white shard of intact spinal column hanging between its teeth as Yukiko's compressed neck tore free of her body. My mind froze in shock, and unbidden I wondered how long it would take before a severed head lost consciousness. I prayed to whatever gods were listening that Yukiko's last moments weren't spent witnessing her grisly fate from inside the giant's mouth. Dropping Yukiko's body in the lake like a broken doll, the skeleton stepped onto the lake's shore, moving its head from side to side as though it was searching for us. Knowing there was no way we could outrun that thing, we hunkered down in the shadows of the trees and hoped the skeleton couldn't see us through the dim light. As we waited frozen in a terrified silence, the gray fog continued to spread slowly from the gaping maw behind it. The fog reached the shore, and we saw something jerkily rise from its gloomy depths. Yukiko's monochrome headless body pierced the top of the murk in its fits and starts. Her formerly vibrant clothes stretched over her bloated body like a stained gray rags, and the slimy chunks of skin visible through them hung from her in place as though she had been under the lake's surface for years. The headless corpse swayed there, facing the shore like it was waiting for something, the fog continuing to advance past it, washing the life and color out of everything it touched and deepening the shadows it passed over. Terrified at the prospect of the fog reaching us and corrupting us, as it had any other thing it touched, I mouthed to Sandy, "We need to go." Her wide eyes met mine, and she nodded shakily. We moved as slowly and silently as our present state would allow, creeping further into the forest and using the mountain to keep us on track. We inched along painfully what felt like hours under the constant threat of the slowly dimming ringing, occasionally catching glimpses of the headless corpse and the skeleton standing guard on the shore. Eventually we moved far enough away that we risked increasing our pace. When the ringing continued to decrease, we moved as fast as possible in the direction we thought the old pilgrim path was, and after a grueling hour we finally found it. Exhausted, we made our way back to the road and flagged down a local for help. Back once more into civilization, Sandy and I concocted a more believable version of our story and presented it to the local police to explain Yukiko's disappearance, saying we had become separated from her in the woods when the weather became extreme. The police let us go, and we returned to our hotel room, where we slept away the horrors of the day. Sandy won't talk about what happened, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. The last thing we heard Yukiko say was Yomi. I've since learned that this is a name for the Shinto underworld, and it was supposedly connected to our world before being sealed off with a boulder by an ancient god. I've been watching a lot of TV while we recover, and I've seen what looks like a local news report of a strange fog spreading around the area that we visited. With the portal open and no gods to be seen, who will save us from the fury of the dead this time? The previous stories all came from the subreddit nosleep. The last story, however, was a little bit more fictional, but a little more entertaining as well. However, coming from a religious standpoint, there might have been something to give that story the origins in past history, and this was maybe just a modern, updated version. Who knows? Maybe you can ask Sandy. So please, if you enjoyed the stories, subscribe and like the video, and we'll keep bringing you further content. Enjoy. Have a great time.